It was one of those days that started off like any other, ordinary, almost forgettable. The kind of day where everything feels like a blur, but you move through it anyway, knowing you're simply going through the motions. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, casting a dull gray over the city as I walked to work. The streets were damp from last night's rain, and the faint smell of wet pavement hung in the air. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just another day. I was running late, of course. I always am. So, as I rushed to the subway station, I chose the quickest route, down the same street I always take. The street I know like the back of my hand. It's a quiet street, tucked between two bustling avenues, lined with aging buildings and small shops. There's the old cafe on the corner, the small bookstore with its faded sign, the weathered bench where the elderly man always sits. I've walked it countless times before, never really paying much attention to the details, just lost in my thoughts, counting the seconds until I reached the station. I passed the cafe, the bookstore, the bench, the usual sights of the street that have become so familiar to me they barely register anymore. And yet, as I neared the end of the block, something caught my eye, a small, fleeting detail that made me stop in my tracks. There, just by the sidewalk, was an old door I had never noticed before. It wasn't there the day before. Or at least, I didn't think it was. The door was small, unremarkable in itself, wooden, with peeling paint and a rusty handle, but something about it made me pause. It wasn't like the others. It was too old, too out of place against the clean, modern buildings surrounding it. I stared at it for a few seconds, wondering if it had always been there, hidden in plain sight, or if I was just too preoccupied with my routine to notice it. I shrugged it off. I was late, after all, and didn't have time to waste. I continued walking, but a nagging feeling followed me, like I was missing something, like the door was calling me back. Still, I didn't stop, and after a few more steps, I arrived at the subway entrance and descended into the underground station. The day passed in its usual blur. The hours dragged on, each one feeling like the last, and by the time the workday was over, I was eager to leave. I wasn't in the mood for small talk or any more meetings. All I wanted was to get home, throw off my shoes, and rest. As I walked back, I found myself retracing my steps, taking the same route I had taken that morning. The city was quieter now, the streetlights flickering on as the sky dimmed, the world settling into a comfortable silence. I approached the same block, and as I neared the spot where the strange door had been earlier, I felt that familiar nagging sensation again, as if something was pulling me toward it. And there it was. But it was different. The door was gone. The small, wooden door that had been tucked away by the sidewalk had vanished. There was nothing in its place, just the bare brick wall, untouched, unchanged. I stood there for a moment, staring at the wall, my mind racing. I had seen it clearly earlier that day. I knew I had. But now, it was as though it had never been there at all. I shook my head, wondering if I had imagined it. Maybe I had been too tired that morning, my mind playing tricks on me. Or perhaps I had passed by it 100 times and never really noticed, and now, seeing it again in my head, I was convinced it had been real. But something in my gut told me it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. I'd seen it. It had been there. And now it wasn't. Confused, I turned to continue on my way. But as I did, I noticed something else. The street was different. The familiar buildings were still there, but the surroundings had shifted slightly. The cafe on the corner? Not the same as I remembered. The sign was slightly off-center, the door a different shade of brown. The bookstore? The windows were darker now, as if the lights had dimmed. The bench where the elderly man usually sat? Empty. It was the same street, but it felt wrong. Like the world around me had slipped, just enough to make everything feel a little out of place. I couldn't pinpoint it, but the change was undeniable. The street had become unfamiliar in a way that made my chest tighten, like I had stepped into some strange version of reality. I took a deep breath and tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was the fog settling in around my thoughts, clouding everything. But when I glanced down at the sidewalk, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. The crack in the pavement, the one I had walked over countless times, had shifted. It was deeper now, wider, as if it had grown while I wasn't looking. I couldn't remember it being so large, so obvious. It was as if the street had changed just by my passing. I walked faster now, my pace quickening, the feeling of unease growing with every step. I reached the subway station again, eager to get away from the street that seemed so different now, so altered. But as I descended into the underground, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something important, something I hadn't noticed until now. I boarded the train, the familiar rhythm of the tracks beneath me offering some small comfort. It was late afternoon when I decided to take a walk, the kind of walk where you have no destination, no reason other than to clear your head. The city was winding down, the usual hustle of the streets muted by the soft glow of the setting sun. I hadn't planned on going anywhere in particular, just down a few blocks, then maybe a turn left, a turn right, whatever felt right in the moment. I wandered aimlessly, letting the sounds of the city wash over me, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional chatter of people passing by. I was just about to turn down a side street when I noticed her. She was sitting on the low brick wall near a small park, her back straight, eyes focused on something in the distance. Her presence felt almost intentional. It was as though she were waiting for something or someone, and she looked up when I passed. Her eyes met mine, not startled or surprised, just calm and knowing. It wasn't that she was particularly remarkable, just a woman with long brown hair, dressed in a simple coat and scarf, but something about her made me stop. "Excuse me," she called, her voice soft but clear, "would you like some help?" I hesitated, not entirely sure why she had singled me out. There was no urgency in her voice, just an odd sense of serenity, as if she knew something I didn't. I took a few steps closer, curious. "I'm fine," I said, trying to offer a polite smile, unsure of what to make of the encounter. She smiled in return, a soft, knowing smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You don't have to be fine," she said. "You just need to follow the path. It will lead you where you need to go." I frowned, unsure of what she meant. The words sounded cryptic, almost like something out of a dream. I looked around, noticing that the small park behind her seemed oddly peaceful, almost too peaceful, like it had been untouched by time. The trees, though sparse, were perfectly arranged, their leaves a vibrant green despite it being late in the season. She gestured toward the path that ran through the park, a narrow, winding walkway that disappeared into the trees ahead. "The path," she said simply, "it's right in front of you. All you need to do is follow it." I glanced at the path, then back at her. There was something compelling about her words, something that made me feel like I should listen, even if I didn't fully understand what she meant. She didn't seem threatening, not at all. Instead, she seemed reassuring, as though she were guiding me, though I hadn't asked for her guidance. The path ahead was quiet, and the trees lining it were tall and dense, their branches forming a canopy above. I felt an inexplicable urge to walk down it, to follow her advice, even though it seemed absurd. Maybe it was my tired mind searching for some escape from the monotony of the day, some way to break the cycle. I nodded, my feet moving before I could second-guess myself. "Okay," I said, almost to myself, but loud enough for her to hear. "I'll follow the path." Her smile deepened, as though she were pleased with my decision. "You'll know when you reach the end," she said softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. "But remember, the path isn't always what it seems." I turned away, stepping onto the path. The gravel crunched under my feet, the faint sound of it mixing with the rustling of the leaves above me. The further I walked, the quieter it became. The city, which had been so alive just moments ago, felt distant now, swallowed up by the thickening silence of the trees. The path curved gently, winding through the park, and I couldn't help but feel like I was walking into something I wasn't meant to understand, like I was crossing into a space that didn't belong to the world I knew. I walked for what felt like hours, though the sky was still bright. There was no real sense of time. The path seemed endless, and yet it never deviated, always leading me forward. The trees loomed overhead, their shadows long and stretching, but I kept moving, unable to stop. Every now and then, I thought I heard the faintest whisper of someone calling my name, but when I turned, there was no one there. Eventually, I reached the end of the path. Or at least, I thought I did. The trees parted in front of me, revealing a large stone wall. It was completely unexpected, and I stopped short, staring at it in confusion. The wall was smooth, cold stone, stretching high into the air, so high that it disappeared into the trees above, hidden in the shadows. The surface was etched with intricate patterns, but I couldn't make out their meaning. It was just a wall. Unmoving, impenetrable. I turned around, expecting to see the path I had walked, but when I looked behind me, the path was gone. The trees were still there, but the way I had come was no longer visible. The place I had walked from had vanished, as though it had never existed at all. I was standing in front of a wall, with no way forward and no way back. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. My heart began to race. The path, the one the woman had told me to follow, had led me here, to this wall, and there was no way through it, no way to continue. I reached out, pressing my fingers against the cold stone, hoping to find a hidden door, some way to move forward, but it was solid, unyielding. "Wait," I muttered, stepping back. This isn't what I was supposed to find." The whisper of the woman's voice echoed in my mind, "The path isn't always what it seems." I backed away, looking around wildly for some clue, some answer, but the forest was silent now, still. The wall loomed ahead, and I felt the weight of something heavy pressing down on me. I was alone. And then I heard the soft sound of footsteps. I turned quickly, my breath catching, expecting someone to be there, to help me. But when I looked, there was no one. The path had vanished. The wall remained. And there, at the edge of the trees, I saw the woman again, standing just at the threshold, watching me. She didn't smile this time. She only nodded, as if she had been waiting for me to understand. "I told you to follow the path," she said, her voice distant, barely a whisper. "But sometimes, the path leads to a wall." And in that moment, I realized that I had been walking into something I could never escape, a place with no answers, no way forward. Just a wall. And a decision. A choice I had made without knowing, a path I couldn't walk again. I turned away from the wall and took a step into the unknown, unsure where it would lead but knowing that whatever the path held, it would no longer be the same. It was an unusually quiet evening, the kind where the city feels more like a ghost town than a bustling metropolis. The streets, usually crowded with people coming and going, seemed oddly still, as if everyone had decided to stay inside, away from whatever strange energy hung in the air. I had stayed at work longer than I'd intended, buried in reports and emails that seemed endless, and now I was heading home, the clock ticking closer to midnight. The air was cool, the wind light, but the streets were eerily empty. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves caught in the breeze and the soft hum of distant traffic. The buildings that flanked the sidewalk towered over me, casting long, twisted shadows across the road. I could hear my footsteps on the pavement, each one echoing in the silence. The city felt too quiet, too still, as if it were waiting for something. I quickened my pace, eager to get home, but something made me pause. There was a sound, footsteps. Soft, almost inaudible at first, but unmistakable. I turned my head to look behind me, half expecting to see someone walking down the street, but the street was still empty. There was no one there. I breathed out a small sigh of relief, but the unease that had crept into my chest didn't go away. I continued walking, my pace picking up again, but this time, the footsteps followed me. They weren't my own. They were too close, too in sync with my movements. I stopped again, briefly, and for a moment, the footsteps paused as well, as though they were waiting for me to start moving again. I glanced around, my eyes darting to the shadows that loomed in the corners of the street, but there was no one, nothing that could explain the sound. I looked ahead, the street stretching out before me, empty, but the feeling of being followed lingered. I started walking faster, trying to shake off the sense of dread that was starting to settle over me, but the footsteps behind me picked up their pace, too, matching my steps exactly, closing the distance between us. My heart began to race, and I could feel the cold sweat gathering at the back of my neck. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I broke into a light jog, my footsteps quickening, the sound of the other footsteps now almost matching mine in speed. The echo of them behind me grew louder, sharper, more urgent. I didn't dare turn around. The fear in my chest was suffocating, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts as I pushed myself harder, trying to outrun whatever, or whoever, was behind me. But as I neared the corner of the street, I heard the unmistakable sound of their footsteps changing direction, following mine exactly. I skidded to a halt at the intersection, my eyes darting in all directions. But the street remained empty. No one was around. No one had turned the corner. My heart was pounding now, my legs shaky as I stood there, frozen. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the empty street behind me, the stillness mocking my fear. But there was nothing. No one. And yet, the footsteps kept getting closer. I couldn't explain it. There was no one following me, no one visible, and yet the sound of footsteps was growing louder, closer, pressing in on me. My mind raced with the possibilities, all of them darker than the last. Was it someone I couldn't see? Was it some trick of my mind? I could feel the weight of it, though. The presence behind me, someone, something, was there, getting closer with every passing second. I turned quickly, hoping to spot someone walking in the other direction, someone who could explain what I was hearing, but again, the street was empty. I was alone. Completely alone. And yet, the footsteps were still there, almost on top of me now. I didn't dare turn around again. I couldn't. The sound of them was deafening in my ears. It was as though they were right beside me now, just a few inches away. I could feel the presence, the shadow of something looming behind me. Without thinking, I broke into a full sprint, my heart thundering in my chest as I ran, my shoes slapping against the pavement in a desperate attempt to escape. But no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps stayed right behind me, matching my pace. They weren't slowing down. They weren't fading. They were getting louder, faster, like they were chasing me now. My breath caught in my throat, panic taking over, as I raced toward my building, fumbling for my keys. I finally reached the door, my hands trembling as I shoved the key into the lock. But just as the door clicked open, I heard it, the sound of the footsteps, right behind me, stopping with me. I slammed the door shut, locking it quickly, my back pressed against the wood as I tried to catch my breath. The apartment felt cold now, the silence pressing down on me, but as I stood there in the dark hallway, I knew something had changed. The weight of what had happened still clung to me, the feeling of being followed, the presence that had been so real, so close. I stood there for a long time, unable to move, unable to breathe, waiting for the sound of those footsteps to return. But they never did. The silence in the apartment was almost unbearable. I finally stepped away from the door, my legs unsteady, my mind trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. I turned on the light, trying to calm my racing heart, but the unease didn't leave. Something was wrong. Something had followed me home. Something had been with me, behind me, and now it was waiting. And I knew, deep down, that the footsteps would follow me again. That no matter where I went, no matter how fast I ran, the footsteps would always be there, just behind me. Waiting. It was one of those days where everything felt just slightly out of place. The weather was off, too hot for early autumn, but with that strange, thin chill in the air that made you second-guess what you were wearing. I had just finished an errand and was walking down a street I'd been down countless times, but today felt different. My steps seemed heavier, like the pavement beneath me was just a little more uneven than it used to be, like the world around me was slightly out of sync. The buildings all looked the same faded storefronts, the same crumbling brickwork, but there was an unfamiliar weight in the air, like something was about to shift. I was lost in my thoughts, half distracted by the vague sense of discomfort that had been following me all day, when I looked up and saw it, a store I didn't recognize. It wasn't a large store, small, tucked in between two other buildings, with a small window display that was filled with items I couldn't make out. The window was partially fogged, the light inside dim, but there was something about it that made me stop. It wasn't the store itself, though. It was the sign. The sign above the door was something I could have sworn I had seen before. The letters were simple, nothing flashy. But the name of the store, printed in faded gold lettering, made my chest tighten for reasons I couldn't explain. Asterisk the Hollow Lantern. Asterisk. I stood there for a moment, staring at the sign, my mind racing, my pulse quickening. I knew that name. I knew it with a certainty that unsettled me. But I had never been here before. I had never stepped inside this store. And yet, the name felt too familiar, like it had always been there, buried somewhere in my memory. I shook my head, trying to clear the unease that was creeping up my spine. I couldn't remember ever seeing the Hollow Lantern in my life, but I knew it. I knew that name in a way that made me feel like I had crossed some invisible line, like I had stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to notice. For a moment, I debated whether or not to enter. The store wasn't anything special, just another old shop, with cracked windows and faded signs. But there was something about it that felt important, like it was waiting for me. I wasn't sure what I expected to find inside, but the pull was undeniable. Something told me that if I stepped inside, would learn something I wasn't ready for. But I did it anyway. The door creaked when I opened it, and the musty smell of old wood and dust greeted me. The inside was dim, lit only by a few flickering lamps along the walls. The shelves were crowded with things I couldn't immediately identify, odd trinkets, vintage books with yellowing pages, and strange objects that seemed to have no place in any store I'd ever been to. There was a sense of disarray, but it felt purposeful, like every item in the store had been placed exactly where it was meant to be. A bell above the door jingled softly as I stepped in, and I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I should stay. But as I glanced around, something made me take another step forward. There was a figure standing behind the counter, an elderly woman with gray hair tied back in a simple knot. She was hunched over slightly, her hands moving carefully over a stack of old, leather-bound books. She didn't look up when I entered, as if she knew I was coming, or as if she expected me to be there. I stood awkwardly near the counter for a moment before she spoke. "Looking for something?" she asked, her voice soft but steady, as though she had been waiting for me to ask. I opened my mouth to speak but found that I didn't know what to say. I had no reason to be here. No explanation for why I was drawn to this shop, to the sign, to the name I couldn't place. I felt like I was out of place, like I was intruding on something I shouldn't understand. I don't know, I stammered, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. "I saw the sign and I know it." The woman nodded slowly, as if she had expected this. Her eyes, though soft, seemed to look right through me. She studied me for a moment, and then she spoke again, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You've been here before," she said, her words sharp, as though they weren't just a statement but a certainty. "You've just forgotten." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. I tried to speak again, but my words caught in my chest, leaving me unable to form a response. How could she possibly know that? I had never been here, not in this life, not in this moment. I was sure of it. But then again, the name, the Hollow Lantern, was so familiar, so tied to me somehow, that I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been here before. That I should have remembered. The woman smiled, a thin, knowing smile. Her eyes never left mine. "It's okay," she said softly. "You'll remember soon enough." I turned away from the counter, my mind spinning with questions I didn't have the answers to. My feet felt heavy, as though the store itself was pulling me in, urging me to stay. I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't leave either. Something told me I was meant to be here, that I had crossed some threshold that had been waiting for me all along. I wandered deeper into the shop, my hand brushing against the shelves of books and trinkets, each one feeling like a silent whisper from another time. There were things here I couldn't quite place, things that seemed to belong to a different world, a different version of me. I stopped at a shelf near the back of the store, my eyes drawn to an old, ornate mirror. The frame was covered in intricate carvings, its surface dusty, but when I wiped it clean, I saw my reflection, but it wasn't quite me. For a moment, I stared at the image of myself, confused. The reflection looked older, wearier, as though it had lived 1,000 lives, each one faded, half-remembered. The woman's voice echoed in my mind, "You've been here before. You've just forgotten." The reflection in the mirror smiled back at me, but it wasn't my smile. It was the same smile I had seen in the shop window when I first saw the sign. I stepped back, my heart racing. The shop felt smaller now, more confined, as if the walls were closing in on me. I turned toward the counter again, but the woman was gone. In her place was an old book, its leather cover worn and cracked. It had no title, but I knew, in some inexplicable way, that it was meant for me. I reached for it, my hands trembling slightly as I opened the first page. There, in faded ink, were the words, "The Hollow Lantern will guide you, when you are ready. But be warned, the path you walk will always lead you back to this place." Asterisk, a cold shiver ran down my spine as I realized the truth. The store, the sign, the name, had all been waiting for me. This wasn't my first visit. And it wouldn't be my last. I stepped away from the counter, my mind racing, the weight of the words settling on my shoulders. The door of the shop creaked open behind me, and before I knew it, I was standing outside once again, the familiar city streets around me. But I knew, deep down, that the path had already started. And the hollow lantern would call me back. It was a Wednesday evening, just after dusk, when I first saw her. I had been walking home from a long day at the office, my thoughts tangled in the usual worries about work, responsibilities, and the things I hadn't gotten around to. The city had that quiet hum to it, the kind that always feels like something is about to happen but never quite does. The streets were busier than I expected, but I didn't mind. There's a comfort in the noise, in the way the city feels like it's always moving, always alive. As I passed by the familiar row of buildings near my apartment, something caught my eye. The rooftop of the building across the street was a bit higher than the others, and though it was common for people to hang out on their rooftops in the summer, I hadn't noticed anyone up there. But tonight, I saw her. She was standing on the edge of the roof, just barely visible from where I stood on the street below. At first, I thought she might be adjusting something, perhaps fixing a plant or leaning over the edge to get a better look at the street, but then she turned toward me. She smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It wasn't an overly expressive grin or anything dramatic. It was a quiet, serene smile, one that felt like she knew something I didn't. Her face was framed by the dimming sky behind her, her figure illuminated by the faint glow of the last bit of daylight. The way she stood there, just looking down at me from that rooftop, felt deliberate. Like she had been waiting for me to notice her. I didn't know why, but the sight of her made my chest tighten. Something about the moment felt off, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. I looked around, half expecting to see someone else nearby, someone else who had seen what I had seen, but the street was empty, just me and her, locked in this strange moment of connection. I stopped walking, staring up at her. For a brief moment, everything seemed to slow down, the bustle of the street, the distant sounds of cars, the chatter of pedestrians, all of it faded away, and it was just the two of us, her smile above me, still soft, but now somehow more knowing. But then something strange happened. As I stood there, watching her, she did something I didn't expect. She waved. The motion was slow, deliberate, like she had all the time in the world. The movement felt almost too casual, like she wasn't acknowledging me from a distance but inviting me to do something. The wave felt like a greeting, but not in the way you greet a stranger, more like a subtle invitation. An invitation I wasn't sure I was ready to accept. I raised my hand in reflex, about to wave back, but something stopped me. My eyes were locked on her figure, and for a split second, I saw something else. I glanced to the side, wondering if anyone else was watching her, but when I turned back to the rooftop, she was gone. Not like she had turned away or moved off the edge of the roof, no, she had simply disappeared. There was no one there now. No trace of her at all. The rooftop was empty, as if she had never been there in the first place. The faint glow from the setting sun was gone, and the building now stood in a dull grayness, its windows reflecting the darkening sky. It was as though the moment had never existed. I stood there for a long time, my hand still suspended in the air, not quite knowing what to do next. The street around me had returned to normal, people walked by, the distant noise of the city filling the silence. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease in my chest. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was just confusion. A strange, lingering feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced up at the window of my own apartment, a few stories below the rooftop I had just been looking at. The blinds were closed. It was dark inside, just like it always was. But as I turned to leave, I felt something tug at the back of my mind, something that whispered to me that I shouldn't walk away so easily. I glanced back at the building across the street, the rooftop where she had stood, but it was dark now. The lights in the windows were all out, the streets around it quiet again. I walked a few more steps, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the moment. She had smiled at me. She had waved. And then she was just gone. But then I stopped. Something about the building's windows caught my eye. The reflection of the streetlights outside shifted in the glass, creating a distorted image. I squinted at it for a moment, but I couldn't shake the odd feeling that something was wrong. I took a few steps closer to my building, trying to dismiss the strange feeling in my chest, but just before I reached the door, I glanced back up. And there, in the reflection of my building's window, I saw her again. She was standing there, just like before, on the rooftop, smiling down at me, her figure framed by the dimming sky. But this time, she wasn't facing the street. She was looking directly at me. Her smile was the same, but now, it felt different. It wasn't warm anymore. It wasn't welcoming. It was something else, something I couldn't place. Her eyes weren't just looking at me, they were through me, as if she could see right into my soul. The chill from before crept back into my bones. I looked away quickly, my heart racing. I didn't know what I had just seen. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew that something had shifted. When I reached my apartment door, I stopped for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle. I glanced back at the window. The rooftop was empty now. There was no one standing there. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled over me. The silence in my apartment felt too heavy now, like something had changed, something I couldn't quite explain. I went to the window and looked out, just to be sure, but the rooftop across the street was empty. No smile, no woman, no strange invitation. But I couldn't shake the thought that she was still there, somewhere in the darkness, watching me. It had been a long day at work. I had stayed later than usual, sorting through last-minute emails and pushing through a mountain of tasks that never seemed to end. By the time I made it to the subway station, the evening rush had died down. The station was quieter than usual, the platform almost deserted. I was exhausted, eager to get home, and as I stood on the platform waiting for my train, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Just a few more stops, and I could unwind in the comfort of my apartment, far away from the clutter of the office. The train came, its familiar rumble signaling its arrival. The doors slid open, and I stepped inside, finding an empty seat by the window. The train was almost deserted, save for a few other passengers scattered across the car. I settled in, leaned my head against the cool glass, and closed my eyes for a moment. The motion of the train, the faint hum of the wheels on the tracks, was comforting in its familiarity. It was routine, something I could do with my eyes closed. My mind drifted, and for a few minutes, I let the thoughts of the day fade away. When I opened my eyes, I was already a few stops into my ride. The train had switched tracks, passing through tunnels I recognized and some I didn't. It was the same route I always took, the same stops, but something felt off. I couldn't quite place it at first, but the atmosphere in the train car had changed. The air felt thicker, the lights slightly dimmer. A strange quietness had settled over the train, almost as if it was too still, like we were moving through a dream rather than a bustling city. The train rumbled on, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced up at the map above the doors, trying to reassure myself that I was on the right track. The stops ticked by, each one a familiar name until we reached one that shouldn't have been there. The train slowed as it approached a station I didn't recognize. I leaned forward, squinting at the sign as the train pulled into the platform. *** Hillcrest Avenue ***, it read. I froze. I had never heard of Hillcrest Avenue. It wasn't on my usual route. I had no idea where it was or why the train had stopped there. I looked around the train car, but no one else seemed to notice. The other passengers sat with their heads down, absorbed in their phones, their books, or the quiet hum of the train. No one else seemed confused, no one else seemed to care. The train came to a complete stop, and the doors opened. The platform outside was eerily quiet. It was smaller than usual, more industrial, with dim lighting flickering overhead. But something about it was familiar. Too familiar. It wasn't just the platform itself that felt like I had been here before. The surroundings, the benches, even the rusted signs on the walls, it all felt oddly comforting, like I had walked this same path 1,000 times, even though I had never been here before. I stood up, the sudden urge to get off the train tugging at me. Something about the station was pulling me in, whispering that I needed to see it, needed to understand why this place felt so familiar. I stepped out onto the platform, my feet tapping lightly on the worn tiles beneath me. As I stood there, the lights overhead flickering and buzzing, I felt a chill creep down my spine. I glanced around, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't explain it, but it was like I had been to this exact station before. Not just once or twice, but as if I had lived here, stood on this exact platform countless times in the past. The details were so vivid, the worn-out benches, the rust on the railings, the shape of the stairs leading down to the other tracks. Even the distant sound of the trains rumbling through the tunnel felt like a memory that had been buried for years, only now resurfacing. I walked to the edge of the platform, my mind racing with confusion. The train had left, disappearing into the tunnel behind me, leaving me standing alone in a place I couldn't recognize, yet felt as if I belonged. I glanced up at the signs along the wall, the faded names of streets and neighborhoods I didn't know. But the name of the station, Hillcrest Avenue, remained, taunting me. Why did it feel so familiar? Why did I know it so well, even though I had never been here? The sound of footsteps broke my trance, and I turned to see a figure walking toward me. A man, dressed in a dark coat, his face obscured by the low light. I couldn't make out his features, but as he approached, he slowed, his pace matching mine. "You're here too," he said, his voice low but clear, almost as if he had been expecting me. I stopped, taken aback by his words. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice coming out more startled than I intended. He smiled, but it wasn't a comforting smile. It was a knowing smile, as if he understood something I didn't. "You've been here before," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "You just forgot." I stepped back, my heart racing, the ground beneath me suddenly feeling unsteady. "I don't understand." "I've never been here before," I protested, trying to make sense of what he was saying. The man didn't respond immediately. He just kept watching me with that same unsettling smile. Then, with a soft chuckle, he said, "You'll remember soon enough." Before I could respond, he turned and walked toward the stairs, disappearing down into the darkened depths of the station. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt the overwhelming urge to leave, to get out of this strange place that felt too real, too familiar. I turned back toward the tracks, but the train I had arrived on was gone, leaving the platform empty and quiet once again. I stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do. The feeling of being lost in time, of stepping into a place that wasn't quite right, gnawed at me. I glanced around one last time, the weight of the unfamiliar familiarity pressing against my chest. And then, with a deep breath, I turned and walked toward the exit, unsure of whether I was leaving the station or entering it once again. It was an ordinary afternoon when I stepped into the cafe. The kind of cafe you forget about the moment you leave, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It was small, too small, really, but there was something comforting about it. The soft buzz of quiet chatter, the clink of coffee cups, the rich scent of roasted beans filling the air. The sort of place where you can escape for a while, sit by the window, and watch the world go by without anyone bothering you. I had been walking aimlessly, lost in my thoughts as I passed through the streets of the neighborhood, when I noticed the cafe. I didn't even think about it, my legs just carried me toward the door, and before I knew it, I was stepping inside. The bell above the door jingled softly as I entered, and I was immediately greeted by the warmth of the cafe, the inviting atmosphere of a place where time seemed to slow down. The walls were lined with mismatched wooden shelves filled with books and small plants, the kind of eclectic decor that made the place feel lived in, like it had been here for years, unchanged by the passing of time. The floor was old wood, worn from years of foot traffic, creaking lightly under my weight. There were only a few people inside, a couple sitting in the corner, a man on his laptop near the window, and the barista behind the counter. The hum of quiet conversations mixed with the soft jazz music playing in the background. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I walked up to the counter, unsure of what I wanted. The barista, a woman with short dark hair, smiled warmly at me. "What can I get for you today?" she asked. But something about the way she looked at me made me pause. It wasn't just the warmth of her smile. It was as though she had seen me before, as if there was something oddly familiar about the way she was looking at me. I ordered a coffee, something simple, my usual choice when I'm in one of those moods where I don't feel like deciding. I paid, my fingers still tingling from the odd sensation that had settled in my chest. I moved to the corner of the cafe, where a table by the window was empty, and I sat down, trying to shake off the strange feeling. I opened my book, hoping to distract myself, but the unease wouldn't go away. The place felt too familiar, like I had been here before, and yet I couldn't recall when or why. I stared out the window for a while, watching the people on the street below, but my mind kept drifting back to the feeling of déjà vu that was building in the pit of my stomach. Then, without warning, it hit me. This was the cafe from my dream. The realization came slowly, like a memory resurfacing, hazy at first, but then sharp and clear. I had been here before. Not physically, but in my dream. The barista, the worn wood floor, the bookshelf stacked with old books, all of it. I had dreamt about this place weeks ago, a vivid dream that had stayed with me long after I woke up. In that dream, I had sat by this very window, sipping coffee, watching the world go by. I had heard the same soft jazz music playing in the background, smelled the same comforting aroma of freshly ground coffee beans. And I had felt exactly the way I felt now, strangely detached, as if I were on the outside looking in. As if this moment, this cafe, this exact situation, had been written long before I walked into it. I looked around the cafe, my pulse quickening. The same old man by the window, the same couple talking quietly in the corner, the same cozy atmosphere. Everything in the cafe felt like it belonged in that dream, and I had no idea how it was even possible. Was it a coincidence? Was I just imagining things? Or was it something more? My coffee arrived, and I thanked the barista, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by the people around me, but by something deeper, something that wasn't bound by the ordinary world. I sat back in my chair, my eyes scanning the room. My thoughts were a whirlwind, struggling to make sense of what was happening. Then, as I glanced to my right, my heart skipped a beat. There, sitting at a table near the window, was a woman. She was staring at me, not in the casual way people glance at each other in public spaces, but with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. She was older than me, with long dark hair and an expression I couldn't quite read. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes seemed to hold something familiar. She looked exactly like the woman from my dream. In the dream, she had been sitting at the same table, wearing the same expression, her eyes locked onto mine with the same unblinking intensity. And in that dream, I had tried to speak to her, but no words ever came out. We had shared a moment of silence, and then, just like that, I had woken up. I blinked, the sensation of déjà vu growing more overwhelming by the second. The woman's gaze didn't waver. It was as if she was waiting for me to acknowledge her, waiting for me to react. I slowly reached for my coffee, trying to steady my hands, but the lid of the cup rattled in my grip. The woman smiled faintly, the same smile from the dream. The same smile that made my heart race with a mixture of fear and recognition. But this time, there was no dream to wake up from. There was only the reality of the cafe, the reality of the moment stretching out in front of me, and the woman who somehow knew me in a way that I couldn't explain. I opened my mouth to speak, to ask her if she knew who I was, but before I could say a word, she stood up and walked toward the door. She passed by my table, her eyes never leaving mine. As she reached the door, she paused, as if to wait for me. But then, she left. The door jingled softly behind her, and the moment she stepped out, I felt a sudden wave of relief wash over me. The strange tension that had been building in the air faded away. I sat there for a long time, my hands still trembling around the coffee cup, staring at the door, waiting for her to come back. But she never did. The rest of the cafe returned to its usual rhythm, the normal sounds of conversation filling the air. I felt the unease slowly slip away, though it lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. As I left the cafe, I couldn't help but wonder, had I really been here before? Or had I simply dreamt it all? And if it was a dream, then why did it feel so real? But there was no answer. Only the quiet hum of the city around me as I walked back into the night, the memory of the cafe, and the woman, still fresh in my mind. It was one of those days where everything felt just a bit too ordinary. The sky was that dull gray of early autumn, the kind that hangs heavy, as if the clouds have nowhere else to go. I had spent the afternoon running errands, moving from one place to another without much thought, checking things off the list, my mind lost in the usual hum of routine. I didn't mind the monotony. It felt safe, predictable. I was used to it. I had just finished at the grocery store and was walking back to my apartment when I saw her. She was standing on the corner, near the park I passed almost every day, her figure silhouetted by the dull light, her back turned to me. She had short black hair, wearing a coat that looked a little out of place for the weather, but there was something about the way she stood that caught my attention. Maybe it was the stillness of her, or the way the wind barely touched her as the leaves swirled around us. As I approached, she turned to look at me, her eyes meeting mine with a look of quiet certainty. I didn't recognize her, but something about her made me stop in my tracks. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm, almost soft. "Turn left here." I blinked, thrown off by the suddenness of it. I had been planning to walk straight ahead, to the usual path that led home. But something about her calm, almost knowing demeanor made me hesitate. "Left?" I asked, unsure of why she was speaking to me at all. She nodded, the same calm smile never leaving her face. "Yes. Turn left, and you'll find what you're looking for." I frowned. What was I looking for? I didn't know. I wasn't looking for anything at all. I just wanted to get home. But there was something about her, something about the way she spoke, that felt right, in a way I couldn't explain. I hesitated for a moment, standing there on the street, the quiet afternoon stretching around us. Something tugged at me, something deep inside, telling me to listen to her. So, without really thinking, I turned left. The street was different immediately. It wasn't like the one I had been walking on. The buildings felt older, the sidewalks narrower, the air a little colder. The shops, which I had passed by 1,000 times, were suddenly unfamiliar. I didn't recognize any of them. They were the same shops, the same signs, but everything about them felt just slightly off. Like I had stepped into a version of the street I hadn't seen before. I continued walking, my footsteps muffled by the damp pavement, but the further I went, the more the feeling of wrongness grew. The street was almost deserted now, save for the occasional person who passed me, their faces blurring in the peripheral of my vision. The quiet was unsettling, a silence that seemed too thick, too oppressive. And then, just as I reached the next intersection, something strange happened. I turned to look back at the street I had just walked down, but I was shocked to see that the street looked familiar again. It looked like the one I had left behind, the one I was sure I had turned away from just a few moments ago. I turned back around, trying to make sense of it. The corner I had turned now felt like it was the same as the one I had just passed. Everything looked right, and yet it was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking in circles, as if the street itself had somehow shifted around me, leading me back to where I had started. I kept walking, my thoughts spinning, but no matter how much I walked, no matter how many turns I made, I ended up back at the same intersection, the one where I had met her. The same street, the same corner, the same place I had just been. It was like I hadn't moved at all. The woman was gone now, her absence a strange kind of weight on the street, like she had never been there at all. I stood there, confused, trying to make sense of what was happening. My eyes flickered between the street signs, the storefronts, and the dim sky above. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt wrong. The buildings, the signs, they were all the same, but they weren't the same. The street I had turned left onto had somehow returned me to the beginning, as if I had never left it. I felt my breath catch in my throat, a tightness forming in my chest. This couldn't be happening. It didn't make sense. I had walked straight ahead just a few moments ago, and now, I was back where I had started. My mind scrambled for an explanation, but none came. I turned to retrace my steps, but the same thing happened again. I reached the same intersection. The same corner. The same street. I had been walking for what felt like hours now, but it felt like nothing had changed, like I hadn't moved at all. The street stretched on endlessly, looping back to itself. The people I passed no longer seemed real. Their faces were indistinct, their movements too smooth, too mechanical. I could feel my pulse quicken, the panic rising in my chest, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't make sense of what was happening. I had no choice but to keep walking, to keep following the invisible thread of the street that seemed to be pulling me, leading me in circles. And then, finally, I saw her again. The woman. Standing at the same corner, just like before. She was smiling at me, the same calm, knowing smile. She didn't say anything this time. She just stood there, waiting for me to realize what had happened. I stopped in my tracks, staring at her, my heart racing. I wanted to ask her why, how, but the words wouldn't come. The moment stretched between us, silent and heavy, until finally, she spoke again, her voice as quiet as the street around us. "Sometimes," she said, "you have to walk in circles before you find your way home." And with that, she turned and disappeared, blending into the shadows as though she had never been there at all. The street, once again, was empty. The path I had walked no longer felt familiar. It had turned into a maze, each corner leading back to the same place, each turn a dead end. The feeling of déjà vu was overwhelming, as though I was trapped in a loop, a place where I couldn't move forward, no matter how much I tried. And in that moment, I realized, I had never really left. I was still walking the same path, still circling the same corner. I was always going to end up right where I started. It was an unusually quiet evening when I decided to take a walk. The kind of night where the air is cool but not cold, the sky a deep blue, the stars barely visible through the thin veil of city light. I didn't have any particular destination in mind, just a need to escape the dim buzz of my apartment and get some fresh air. The city was quieter than usual, with most of the usual hustle and bustle muted by the late hour. There was a strange stillness in the air, something I couldn't quite place, but it didn't stop me from stepping out into the cool night. I walked along the familiar streets, my footsteps echoing softly in the quiet. The streetlights above me cast their pale yellow glow on the sidewalk, their light flickering in the occasional gust of wind. The shadows stretched long across the pavement, warping and twisting as the light flickered, but everything felt peaceful, even though there was something slightly unsettling about the way the light seemed to pulse. It wasn't the normal flickering of malfunctioning bulbs. It was as though the lights themselves were trying to tell me something, trying to warn me. I told myself it was just my imagination. I continued walking, my eyes drifting up to the streetlights, watching as they flickered again. The dim light grew weaker, flickering in and out like an old television struggling to maintain a signal. For a moment, the street was swallowed by darkness, and then the light came back, pale and uneven, as if the night was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And that's when I saw it. The shadows. At first, they were just that, shadows, cast by the streetlights and the buildings around me. But then, as the light flickered again, the shadows moved. Not in the way shadows normally move, following the contours of the street or the trees as the light shifts. These shadows moved on their own, independent of anything around them, slipping between the gaps in the sidewalk, swaying as though they had a mind of their own. I stopped in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one around. No cars, no pedestrians, just me and the street. And yet, the shadows, they were moving in and out of the light, twisting and coiling like something alive. They didn't belong. They shouldn't have been moving. The streetlights above me flickered again, but this time, the shadows grew longer, stretching toward me as though they were reaching for something. I blinked, trying to convince myself I was seeing things. Maybe the flickering lights were playing tricks on my eyes. But when I looked closer, I saw them more clearly. The shadows weren't just flickering. They were alive. They moved with purpose, shifting across the pavement like they were avoiding the light, like they were aware of it. I took a step backward, my heart beginning to race. The shadows continued to move, flowing along the edges of the street, sliding beneath parked cars, disappearing behind lamp posts, only to reappear in new places as if they were never really gone. They were too fast. Too fluid. I wasn't sure what to do. Part of me wanted to run, to get out of there as quickly as possible, but another part of me was rooted in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the strange scene unfolding before me. The street, once so familiar, now felt alien. I couldn't explain why, but the shadows didn't feel like they were just a product of the flickering lights. They felt like something else. Something other. Suddenly, the shadows around me seemed to merge, all of them, weaving together in a dark swirl, converging on the very spot where I stood. The flickering light above me cast a brief, disorienting glow, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in the shadows. A figure. Its outline was indistinct, but there was no mistaking its shape. It was tall, looming, and it was moving toward me. I gasped, taking another step back, but my feet felt heavy, like I was wading through thick fog. The figure was still there, pulling itself out of the shadows, its form growing clearer, taking on the shape of a person, but without any features, without a face. Just a silhouette, dark and endless, reaching out from the shadow. The light flickered again, and for a brief moment, everything went pitch black. I felt my heart race, panic swelling in my chest. When the light returned, the figure was gone. The shadows were still there, but they no longer moved. They were frozen in place, as though the world had stopped, and I had been left in the middle of something I couldn't understand. I took another step back, still unsure of whether I should run or stay. The street was empty, the shadows still stretching across the pavement in long, twisted shapes. The air felt heavier now, thick with something I couldn't name. The streetlights flickered once more, and the shadows seemed to pull back, retreating into the darkness as the light settled back into its normal, steady glow. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the darkness had played tricks on my mind, or maybe I had been more tired than I thought. But as I turned to leave, I glanced down the street one last time. And in the reflection of the store window across the street, I saw them again. The shadows, still shifting, still moving, still lurking just beyond the light. I ran then. I didn't look back. The shadows, whatever they were, didn't follow me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked, that they knew I had seen them. They were waiting for me, just out of sight, just beyond the reach of the light. And no matter how fast I ran, I could feel them, there, always watching from the edges of the dark. The streetlights flickered one last time as I reached my apartment, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I locked the door behind me, my chest still tight with the lingering fear of what I had seen. The shadows were still out there, just waiting for the next flicker of light, the next moment when they could slip through. I'm not sure if they'll ever leave. They've been following me, watching me from the dark, ever since that night. And no matter where I go, I can always feel them, waiting just beyond the light. It was one of those quiet days when I had nowhere in particular to be, and everything felt still in a way that made me uneasy. The sun was muted behind a layer of clouds, and the streets were mostly empty, save for a few scattered people hurrying to and from their own places. I wandered through the city, the hum of the world around me dull and distant, until I found myself in front of the old library. I had passed it countless times before, but today, for some reason, something about it called to me. The library was one of those old, stone buildings with an intricate facade, its entrance guarded by two tall columns, and the scent of old paper and leather that seemed to cling to it. It had an air of mystery, like it was hiding something just beneath the surface, something that no one had yet discovered. On a whim, I pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The familiar musty smell of aged books greeted me, and the quiet hum of the place was oddly soothing. The library was practically empty, just a few people browsing the shelves, their footsteps soft against the worn wooden floors. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me as I wandered deeper into the building, taking in the towering shelves filled with books on every imaginable subject. I had no particular goal in mind as I walked, just a vague curiosity to see what I might stumble upon. I passed rows of novels, histories, biographies, books on science and art, but as I moved deeper into the aisles, something caught my eye. It was a section in the back of the library, tucked away in a dim corner I had never noticed before. The shelves here were full of books, but they weren't like the others. These books were different, newer, their covers smooth and pristine, standing out against the more worn-out ones around them. Drawn to them, I reached out and pulled one from the shelf. The cover was plain, but the title made my heart skip a beat, *The Story of Me*. I opened the book, my fingers trembling slightly as I flipped through the pages. The words on each page were written in a familiar script, but they didn't tell a story I recognized. No, they told my story. My name, my childhood, my thoughts, my experiences, all of it laid out in meticulous detail, as though someone had been watching me, following me through my life, recording every event as it happened. I quickly closed the book, my heart racing, but the strange sensation of familiarity lingered. I glanced at the other books on the shelf, drawn to them like magnets, each one with a similar title. The Story of Me, Volume 2. The Story of Me, The Years I Forgot. The Story of Me, My Future. I couldn't stop myself. I reached for another book, then another, each one pulling me deeper into the strange collection. The more I read, the more it became clear, these books weren't just about me, they were written by me. At least, that's what it felt like. Each book was a continuation, a chapter of my life that I hadn't lived yet, a moment that hadn't happened. The words on the pages described things I hadn't yet experienced, conversations I hadn't had, choices I hadn't made, all written in a voice that felt eerily like mine. There were things in these books that hadn't happened yet, but somehow, they felt like memories I hadn't remembered yet. The future was unfolding in these pages, like some strange premonition. I felt a chill creep down my spine, and my fingers froze on the spine of the next book. I pulled my hand away, the air around me suddenly thick with unease. I took a step back, my eyes scanning the shelves. There were hundreds of books, each with a title that seemed to describe another part of my life. They were all about me. My name was on the covers, but it wasn't my handwriting. It was as if someone had been following me, documenting everything I did, every thought I had. I picked up one last book, the smallest one of them all. It didn't have a title, just a blank cover. I hesitated before I opened it, my heart pounding. As I flipped through the pages, I saw that this book was different. It was about today. It was about right now. My eyes raced across the words, each sentence describing my exact movements, my thoughts, even my emotions in ways that felt like they had been written just seconds ago. It was as if this book was being written in real time. The pages described my entrance into the library, how I had walked to the back, and even my hesitation before picking up the books. The last sentence I read described the moment I opened the book I was holding, and I looked up, only to see that the words had stopped. The pages were blank, the story suspended in mid-sentence. My heart pounded in my chest as I felt the weight of the silence settle around me. The library seemed to have grown darker, the walls pressing in, the air heavy with something unspoken. I looked around at the other books, all of them filled with my life, my choices, and yet, in that moment, I felt like I was no longer in control. It was as if my story had already been written, as though every step I took had been predicted, every thought already recorded. I closed the book and stepped back, my head spinning with confusion and dread. What was this place? Why was my life laid out in these pages, as if it were already decided, already known? I suddenly felt trapped, like I was a character in a story that wasn't mine to write, and yet, somehow, it was. I turned and hurried out of the aisle, my footsteps quickening. I couldn't stay in that place, surrounded by books that told me things I wasn't ready to understand. But as I walked toward the exit, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the one leaving the library. That I had been in the story all along, that my every movement, every action, had already been written before I even made them. The door to the library swung open with a soft creak, and I stepped out into the cool night air. But as I did, I looked back at the building, and for just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the window, watching me. The figure was blurred, indistinct, but I could feel its gaze, as if it were waiting for me to return. I walked away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the story wasn't over. It had only just begun. It was a crisp autumn evening when I found myself walking through the park, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the last remnants of the season's fallen leaves. The fog had rolled in quietly, creeping over the path and curling around the trees, softening the edges of the world around me. The streetlights were faint halos in the distance, their glow barely cutting through the dense mist. Everything felt muted, as if the fog had swallowed up sound itself, leaving only the quiet of the world. I was alone, as I often was when I took these walks, away from the noise, away from the bustle of life. It was my time to clear my head, to let my thoughts drift as aimlessly as I walked. There was something soothing about the fog, something isolating, but not in a bad way. It wrapped around you like a blanket, hiding the world just enough to make it feel as if you could disappear into it, if only for a little while. I don't know why I noticed her at first. I had passed by the same bench 100 times, but tonight, there she was, sitting on the bench, her figure barely visible in the swirling fog. She was hunched over slightly, her head bowed, as though she were lost in thought or perhaps lost to the world around her. Her clothes were ordinary, a coat and scarf, the colors blending into the fog, but there was something about the way she sat there that made me pause. It wasn't the way she looked, but the stillness in her, unmoving, like she belonged to the mist itself. It was almost as if she had appeared out of nowhere, a part of the fog, waiting. I stopped walking, hesitant to disturb her, but something urged me to speak. "Are you all right?" I called, my voice almost lost in the fog. At first, there was no response. She didn't look up, didn't move. I almost turned away, thinking she hadn't heard me, but then her voice broke through the stillness. "I'm fine," she said, her voice soft, but clear. It was a gentle sound, like a whisper in the wind, but there was something about it, something familiar. It sounded like it came from a place I knew well, even though I had never heard it before. I stepped closer, drawn to her inexplicably. "Are you sure?" I asked again, my voice tentative. The fog seemed to press in closer as I stood there, as if the world itself had slowed down to wait for the answer. She didn't look up, but there was a slight shift in her posture, like she was acknowledging me in some way. "I'm just waiting," she said, her voice trailing off as if the sentence were unfinished. Her words felt like they were meant for someone else, something more than just me. "Waiting for what?" I asked, not sure why I cared to know, but unable to stop the question from slipping out. She finally raised her head, her eyes meeting mine, though her gaze was distant, unfocused. "For you," she said, her eyes not fully seeing me, but seeing something far beyond. "I've been waiting for you to find me." A shiver ran down my spine. There was something in her voice, in the way she spoke, that made my heart race. It wasn't just what she said, it was the certainty in her words, the way they hung in the air between us like a promise I couldn't understand. I felt the fog close in, thickening around us, until it seemed as though we were in a world of our own. "Who are you?" I asked, taking a cautious step closer. She smiled then, but it wasn't a smile of recognition. It was something else, something knowing, as if she had seen the world from angles I couldn't begin to imagine. "Someone you've been looking for," she said, her voice now quieter, like a secret shared only between the two of us. I felt a strange sensation in my chest, a knot that tightened the more I listened. Her words made no sense, yet they felt undeniable. I knew her. I should have known her, though I couldn't place how or why. But before I could say anything else, she stood up slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate, like she had been waiting for this moment, too. Then, without another word, she turned and began to walk into the fog, disappearing into the mist as if it had swallowed her whole. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't in a hurry. She simply walked, each step deliberate and sure, as though she had a path to follow that only she could see. I stood there for a long moment, rooted to the spot. Something inside me urged me to follow her, to chase after her into the fog, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My legs felt like lead, my thoughts too tangled to act. The fog seemed to have deepened, swirling around me in heavy clouds that made everything feel distant, disconnected. I wanted to call out to her, but the words caught in my throat, the air too thick to breathe. I strained to see her figure, but she was gone. The only sound was the soft rustling of the fog itself, as if the world had swallowed her, leaving no trace behind. I took a step back, still unable to comprehend what had just happened. The bench where she had been sitting was now empty. The street around me was silent. I turned to leave, to walk back the way I came, but just as I turned the corner of the path, I heard something, her voice, faint but unmistakable. "Don't leave." I froze. My heart skipped a beat, my pulse racing in my ears. The voice wasn't just in my head, it was real, as though it were being carried on the wind, whispering through the fog. The words were soft, pleading, but there was no one in sight. I glanced around again, but the park remained empty. There was no one waiting. There was no one to find. I took a deep breath, shaking my head as if trying to clear away the thoughts that had suddenly consumed me. I turned back and started walking, my footsteps quickening as I left the park behind. But even as I walked away, the echo of her voice lingered in my mind. Don't leave. And with every step, I couldn't help but wonder, who had she been? Why had she called out to me? Was she real, or was she a part of the fog itself, something the mist had conjured up just for me? But as I reached the edge of the park, and the city lights bled through the fog, I realized one thing: though I had left the park, I hadn't left her behind. Her voice, her presence, stayed with me, hovering in the quiet corners of my mind, waiting for the moment I'd hear it again. And somewhere in that fog, I knew she was still waiting. The night had fallen quickly, draping the city in a soft, velvety darkness. The air was cool, and a light mist had begun to roll in, blurring the edges of the streetlights. I had been walking for what felt like hours, just wandering aimlessly with no destination, no real reason for my steps. It had been a long day, and I needed a break from the noise in my mind, the endless clutter of thoughts that wouldn't stop swirling. I found myself standing at the foot of a bridge, one I had crossed many times before but had never really paid attention to. It was a small bridge, stone, arching over a narrow creek that wound through the city like a forgotten artery. The bridge itself was old, the stone worn smooth by time, with iron railings that had been painted so many times their color was chipped and faded. The street was empty, as if everyone else had retreated inside to escape the dampness of the night. The fog was thick now, curling around the base of the bridge and spreading out across the street. I stood there for a moment, looking out at the still water below, watching the faint ripples distort the reflection of the streetlights. I don't know why, but I had the sudden urge to cross the bridge. Maybe it was the silence, or the feeling that I was on the cusp of something. Something I couldn't quite put into words, but something that tugged at me, urging me forward. Without thinking, I began to walk across. The bridge creaked under my footsteps, the sound strangely loud in the otherwise quiet night. I took my time, the cool mist brushing against my skin, and the fog thickening with each step. It wasn't a long bridge, but by the time I reached the other side, I felt a strange sensation, like something was off, like the very act of crossing it had shifted something, changed the air. When I reached the other side, I stopped, momentarily disoriented. The street before me was familiar, too familiar. The same street I had started on. The same buildings, the same signs, the same shops. Nothing had changed. But there was something wrong about it. The angle of the street, the way the shadows fell, the way the light flickered, it all felt wrong. I looked back at the bridge, but it was just a simple stone arch, standing quiet and still in the fog. I thought I had crossed over to a new part of the city, but now, standing at the edge of the street, I felt like I had somehow looped back to where I had begun. I took a few steps forward, the sound of my footsteps mingling with the hum of the distant city, but as I walked, the strange feeling of déjà vu settled over me. The buildings around me were exactly the same as the ones I had passed earlier. The same shops, the same streetlights. Nothing had changed. I glanced down at my watch, but the time hadn't shifted, hadn't moved. It was as if I hadn't gone anywhere at all. The bridge had led me back. I couldn't explain it. The bridge wasn't a portal, it wasn't some trick of the light or some urban illusion. It was just a bridge. A regular old bridge. Yet somehow, it had taken me in a circle, back to the street I had just left, as if the city itself had folded in on itself, trapping me in a loop I couldn't break free from. I turned around, walking back toward the bridge. The fog had grown heavier, thickening the air until it felt like I was walking through a cloud. My breath came out in visible puffs, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing by the bridge in the distance. The silhouette was vague, indistinct, but I could feel its presence. I took a step toward it, my heart pounding, but when I reached the bridge, the figure was gone. The bridge was empty. I stood there for a moment, looking at the familiar stretch of street on the other side, but I couldn't bring myself to walk back across. The sense of unease, of something being wrong, was overwhelming. It wasn't just that I had crossed the same street twice. It was that the street felt different now. The air felt heavier, as if the world around me had been altered, like I was walking in a version of the city that wasn't quite real, a place that had been distorted. I turned away from the bridge, unsure of where to go, but the fog had thickened, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't in control anymore, that the city had become something else. Something that knew me. Knew my steps. My path. The streetlights flickered as I walked further down the street, the soft glow casting long shadows on the pavement, but every corner I turned, every block I walked, seemed to lead me back to the same place. The same street. The same buildings. The same fog. The realization settled in slowly, like a weight that grew heavier with each passing moment. I couldn't escape. No matter how far I walked, I couldn't leave this street. I had crossed the bridge, but it had only taken me back to where I started. I don't know how long I walked or how many times I turned around, trying to find a new way out. The city was silent now, almost suffocatingly so, and the fog wrapped around me like a shroud, whispering its secrets in the distance. Eventually, I stopped. I stood there in the middle of the street, staring at the same old buildings, the same old streetlights, the same old bridge behind me. And in that moment, I knew, there was no way out. No matter how many times I crossed the bridge, no matter how many turns I took, I would always end up back here, on the same street, in the same place. The bridge had led me to a place where time had bent, and I was trapped in a loop, a never-ending repetition of the same steps, the same path. And in the quiet of the night, in the thick fog that surrounded me, I realized one final thing: I was never meant to leave. This street would always be my home.